The ambulance lights painted everything red and blue across Maplewood Heights as paramedics rushed toward the house at the end of Sycamore Lane. My neighbor, 87-year-old Harold Jameson, was being wheeled out on a stretcher, his face gaunt and his breathing labored. The entire neighborhood stood frozen on their lawns, watching in horror as the man who once built half the decks in the subdivision was loaded into the back of an emergency vehicle. Standing at her doorway with her arms crossed, his granddaughter and our HOA president, Rebecca Hartley, actually had the audacity to shout after the EMT workers that they were parked illegally, according to subsection 4.3 of our community guidelines. She said it with such conviction that one of the paramedics actually turned around to stare at her in disbelief before shaking his head and closing the ambulance doors. My name is David Morrison, and I've lived in Maplewood Heights for 12 years. I moved here after my divorce, looking for a quiet place to rebuild my life and focus on my work as a freelance architect. What I found instead was a neighborhood ruled by the iron fist of Rebecca Hartley, a 35-year-old real estate agent who treated her HOA presidency like she was running a small dictatorship. She'd been elected 3 years ago on a platform of maintaining property values. But what she really maintained was a reign of terror over anyone who dared plant the wrong color petunias. Rebecca had moved her grandfather Harold in with her 6 months ago after he'd fallen at his apartment across town. At first, we were all impressed by her dedication to family. Harold was a widower, a Korean War veteran who'd worked 40 years as a carpenter before retiring. He used to sit on Rebecca's porch in the mornings, waving at joggers and sharing stories about building homes back when craftsmanship still mattered. But slowly, we saw less and less of him. Rebecca claimed he preferred staying inside, that the heat bothered him. But through the window, I could see him sitting in the same chair day after day, staring at a television that wasn't even turned on half the time. When I mentioned this to her during an HOA meeting, she dismissed my concern with a wave of her manicured hand and proceeded to fine me $200 for having my trash cans visible from the street for more than 12 hours. The situation escalated when I started documenting things. I wasn't trying to be nosy, but my home office window faced their backyard, and what I saw disturbed me. Harold would be outside for hours in the blazing sun without water, trimming hedges with shaking hands while Rebecca supervised from the air-conditioned comfort of her kitchen. Once, I watched him collapse onto the grass, and it took her 20 minutes to notice because she was on her phone arguing with someone about fence heights. The worst incident I witnessed happened on a particularly hot August afternoon. Harold was up on a ladder cleaning gutters, something number 87-year-old should be doing in 100 degrees heat. His hands were trembling so badly that he dropped the cleaning tool 3 times. Rebecca came out not to help him down, but to berate him for working too slowly. She actually said, and I recorded this on my phone, that if he couldn't contribute to the household maintenance, she'd have to consider whether her home was the right place for him. The implied threat of a nursing home hung in the air like the oppressive heat. I started keeping a detailed log of everything I observed, Harold being locked out of the house for hours because Rebecca claimed he'd forgotten his key again, even though I'd seen her remove it from his keychain, Harold eating cat food from a can in the garage while Rebecca hosted her book club with catered sandwiches and wine. Harold sleeping on a mattress on the floor while Rebecca converted his promised bedroom into her home office for her real estate business. I tried talking to other neighbors, but everyone was terrified of Rebecca's retaliation through the HOA. She'd already forced the Johnsons to repaint their house twice because the shade of beige wasn't quite right, and she put a lien on old Mr. Kumar's property over unpaid fines for grass that was a quarter-inch too tall. The breaking point came during the 4th of July block party. Harold showed up looking frail and confused, wearing a winter coat in 90 degrees weather. When I quietly asked if he was okay, he grabbed my arm with surprising strength and whispered that Rebecca had been taking his Social Security checks and giving him only $20 a week for personal expenses. He said she'd sold his car without telling him and thrown away his medications because she claimed they made him too drowsy to do yard work. That night, I called Adult Protective Services. The next morning, Rebecca was at my door with a stack of violation notices 3 inches thick. She'd found infractions dating back 2 years, including citations for the angle of my satellite dish and the font used on my mailbox numbers. The total fines came to over $8,000. She said, with a smile that dripped venom, that she'd be placing a lien on my property by the end of the week if I didn't pay immediately. But I'd anticipated this. For months, I'd been quietly gathering evidence of Rebecca's own violations, not just of HOA rules, but of state and federal laws. Using my architectural knowledge, I documented that her home additions violated building codes. I'd recorded her using HOA funds for personal purchases at the local hardware store. Most importantly, I'd been in touch with Harold's doctor, who confirmed that Harold had been prescribed 6 different medications that he hadn't been receiving. The investigation moved faster than I expected. Within a week, APS had opened a case, and Rebecca was scrambling to cover her tracks. She suddenly started taking Harold to doctor appointments and posting photos on social media of them having grandfather-granddaughter lunches. But it was too late. The investigators saw through her performance immediately, especially when Harold couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten a full meal that wasn't leftovers Rebecca deemed too old for herself. The emergency that night happened because Harold had developed a severe infection from untreated diabetes. Rebecca had been hiding his insulin, claiming it was too expensive and that diet and exercise would cure him. The infection had spread to his bloodstream, and if the ambulance had arrived even an hour later, the doctors said he wouldn't have survived. While Harold fought for his life in the ICU, the investigation into Rebecca exploded into something bigger. They discovered she'd been doing this to her grandfather for years, even before he moved in with her. She convinced him to sign power of attorney documents while he was recovering from surgery, then systematically drained his retirement accounts. The house repairs she forced him to do saved her thousands in contractor fees while she collected his benefit checks. The other HOA board members, emboldened by Rebecca's absence, called an emergency meeting. They discovered she'd been embezzling from the HOA funds for 3 years, using the money for her real estate business expenses and personal shopping sprees. The meticulous records she kept to punish residents became evidence of her own financial crimes. Every fine she'd collected had been inflated, with the extra money going directly into her personal account. When Rebecca was arrested at the hospital while visiting Harold, she actually tried to serve the arresting officer with an HOA violation for parking in a visitor spot without a proper permit. Even as they read her rights, she was screaming about property values and the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. She demanded to know who would enforce the holiday decoration timeline and who would measure everyone's grass height. The trial was swift and decisive. The prosecution presented evidence of elder abuse, financial exploitation, embezzlement, and fraud. They showed bank records revealing that Rebecca had stolen over $200,000 from Harold's accounts over 2 years. She'd sold his deceased wife's jewelry, claiming she was keeping it safe, and used the money for a vacation to Hawaii. She'd cashed in his life insurance policies and bonds that were meant for his end-of-life care. The prosecutor displayed photographs that made the jury gasp. Pictures of Harold's living conditions in Rebecca's garage, the padlock she'd installed on the refrigerator to keep him from eating her food, the bucket she'd given him to use as a bathroom at night because she didn't want him walking through her house. There were screenshots of text messages where Rebecca complained to friends about the burden of caring for Harold while simultaneously bragging about the free labor she was getting for her rental properties. Harold, recovering but still weak, testified via video link from his rehabilitation facility. His testimony was heartbreaking as he described months of hunger, confusion from missing medications, and physical exhaustion from forced labor. He talked about how his own granddaughter had told him he was a burden, and that the yard work was the only way he could earn his keep. He broke down crying when he described how Rebecca had thrown away his photo albums from the war, calling them worthless clutter that was bringing down her home's energy. Rebecca's defense attorney tried to argue that she was overwhelmed by caregiving responsibilities and HOA duties, but the jury wasn't buying it. The evidence was too overwhelming, from the thousands of dollars in mysterious HOA expenses to the medical records showing Harold's preventable decline. Multiple neighbors testified about her reign of terror and the fear she'd instilled in anyone who might have spoken up sooner. During sentencing, the judge called Rebecca's actions a betrayal of the highest order, violating both the trust of her community and the sacred duty of caring for an elderly relative. He noted that she'd shown no remorse throughout the trial, still insisting that she'd done nothing wrong and that Harold had been exaggerating his condition. Even as the sentence was read, she was muttering about how the courthouse lawn violated several landscaping ordinances. Rebecca Hartley was sentenced to 5 years in prison for elder abuse and embezzlement, with additional fines totaling $300,000 to be paid in restitution to Harold and the HOA. As the bailiff led her away, she turned to the gallery and shouted that she'd be appealing and would return to restore proper order to Maplewood Heights. Her face went white when the judge added another 6 months for contempt of court.